Okay, thank you. Thanks, Maria. So your panelists for this session, in order of presentation, are Hannah Vickers. Hannah is the Chief Executive Officer of the Association of Consultancy and Engineering, and also a board member of CIC. And Hannah led the work to produce the Construction Leadership Council's guidance on the Job Retention Scheme. Steve Corbett is the Head of Client Services at Capita, who is leading the work for government on the Work Exchange Programme. Steve is joined by his colleagues Dave Hanna and Alan Herbert. We then have Andrew Snowden of UHY Hacker Young, followed by Michael Archer of Beale & Co, who will give respectively an accountant's view of the financial payroll issues related to the schemes and an employment law view. After Hannah and Steve's presentation, there will be an opportunity to address questions and for us to receive feedback, and there'll be similar opportunity to Andrew and Michael at the end of the presentations. So by way of background, the Construction Leadership Council has convened a construction industry task force to provide a focal point for coordinating the industry response to COVID-19 and to facilitate communication between the industry and government. Its objective is to sustain the industry through the current period when restrictions are in place, and to ensure that the industry is able to drive economic growth and prosperity in the UK once the virus has been beaten. The members are comprised of trade associations representing both large and small firms in the construction sector, including contractors, specialist contractors, home builders, product manufacturers, merchants, and associated professional services, as well as government departments and major clients of industry. The members include CIC's Chief Executive, Graham Watts, and also Hannah. The task force meets daily to share market intelligence and provide updates on issues of concern to the construction sector, as well as information about the support that is available to firms in the industry. This information is published and is available to all firms and individuals working in the industry. To date, the task force has issued guidance to the industry on site operating procedures consistent with the Public Health England guidelines, the temporary suspension of work on construction sites and contractual matters arising out of COVID-19, guidance on the Job Retention Scheme and the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme, and launched an appeal for the construction sector to donate available personal protective equipment to the NHS. Additionally, conference calls continue with the Construction Minister, Nadeem Zahawi, and indeed only last week I put to him the issues in particular that micro businesses in the industry are facing. So that's enough from me, and I'd like to now hand you over to Hannah.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I'm going to caveat my presentation with saying that although I rate the Construction Leadership Council's guidance on this, I am not an HR expert. So what I'll be covering in my presentation will be some detail of how you might go about this sort of process to take this newly introduced scheme and think through how you would apply it within your firm, be that a construction or a consultancy or professional services firm. So I'll talk through a little bit of that process, and then I should also talk through some of the sort of industry specific things that we have encountered, that we have sort of discussed on the calls around how you might implement it. So it gives a slightly more specific construction sector view, whereas some of my fellow panelists will cover in more detail some of the sort of legal backing and things of the scheme. So when we come to the Q&A, I shall be deferring those questions to them, but I'm very happy to take construction interpretations, shall we say, of the scheme. So Maria, if you'd be able to put my first slide up, please. Okay, so I said the two things I'm going to talk through are a bit of a process around how you might use the scheme in construction, and then secondly, a little bit around things that furloughed workers can do. So if we just start with describing a little bit around what a furlough is. Now, it's a government-backed scheme, which means that you can effectively furlough or sort of temporarily stand down part of your workforce. Now, I said I'm not going to go into much more detail than that, but the process that I'm going to talk you through specifically for construction is to think about how you decide and who is eligible to be put onto this furlough scheme. Now, effectively in doing that, it's actually very good for the employees because they will receive at least 80%, or the government will cover 80% of their salary, and you as an employer have an option to top up the remaining 20%. So in principle, you would be potentially putting employees into this sort of furloughed pool and actually maintaining their income. So it is very much seen by the government as an opportunity to move staff that are perhaps not fully utilised, perhaps not being deployed onto site, but still keep them employed by your company and still support businesses to employ them, even if they aren't fee earning, even if they aren't perhaps generating revenue. So the guidance that we've issued, and I would encourage everybody to go to the CLC website to download this. I think we'll be able to circulate it afterwards, but the guidance we have issued as the Construction Leadership Council really takes the government high-level principles and starts to answer some of the construction-specific questions. So things that we will encounter because of the types of work that we do, because of the types of contracts that we're involved with. So there is a very thorough frequently asked questions in that document, as well as this diagram that I shall just talk you through shortly, which really describes the process for how you might apply this furloughing scheme to your particular business. And this is meant to be a suggested process. Obviously, firms can interpret the guidance provided they stick within the legal jurisdiction however they want to. The idea behind this is to try to get some level of consistency so that actually we have businesses starting to apply this in a consistent way across the industry, because we know that actually, you know, a lot of the employees are well networked, they will talk. So if we have inconsistency, it's unlikely to be helpful to particular businesses if they're taking a very, very different view. So I shall just talk you through now for a few minutes, a little bit of detail around how you might apply this. So you know the scheme's available, you know you've got the opportunity to be able to furlough people. So the first question that we sort of look at in terms of our overall employees is actually, we're again referring back to the Construction Leadership Council's site operating procedures. So, you know, if they're unable to work, when you take into account those site operating procedures, maybe their site is closed, maybe they can't safely continue their work and therefore you are having to stand them down, then they would be eligible. The second very sort of simple category for people to be, you know, put onto furlough or put into this scheme would be if their usual workplace is closed. So perhaps, you know, if you have an office, you've got receptionists or you've got canteen staff. Now, for the period that their office is closed, clearly they're not able to conduct their job. So again, they would be eligible for furlough. So you can sort of take your overall workforce planning through that lens. So anybody that falls into either of those two categories, straight away you can consider furloughing them. Now, perhaps it's not that simple, and I appreciate that there is, you know, this probably falls for the vast majority of your staff, that actually maybe you're seeing a shortfall in workload. So maybe what you've got, if you're running a consultancy business, for example, is a reduction in the pipeline of work, and you're seeing your utilisation drop. So if that's the case, say, you know, and I'll use a worked example here, say you've got 100 engineers, but you've only got work for 80. What you can look at would be to identify the number and the type of positions at risk. I'm not saying that this is, you know, moving towards redundancy, but it's the same sort of mindset. So I've got 100 engineers, I've only got work for 80. You know, if this were sort of normal times, I would be looking at those 20 positions be needing to be moved out of the business to be made redundant. So you go through that process and you say, okay, so perhaps I've got 20 positions. So then we move into the next blue box. This is where it starts to get a little bit more complex, because we do have, obviously, some of our functions as an industry are critical, you know, so we need to be a little bit careful about maintaining the capacity of the organisations to be able to support that. And in addition, we know that in some circumstances, some of our employees might be designated as key workers by clients. So again, you know, you need to sort of start to consider that. So if you have that position, what you need to look at is actually having a bit more, you know, if you have got people who are key workers, if you are undertaking critical work, you know, obvious things like maintenance to hospitals, you know, maintenance to nuclear power plants, the sorts of things where you really wouldn't want to be walking away, or your clients have specifically designated them as key workers, you need to take a bit more of a structured activity around who you furlough. Now, if you don't have that, actually, if you think, you know, I've got, you know, sort of more or less from my 100 engineers, I don't mind which 20 go on furlough, you can open it up and offer it on a voluntary basis. Now, this is quite an interesting point, and I'm sure we'll come back to it, but staff, you know, effectively need to volunteer. It's got to be done in agreement with them when you do furlough them. So actually offering a voluntary furlough is something that, you know, sort of gets you over that hurdle because you're not having to enforce it. And really, if I just sort of follow along the bottom track at the moment, offering that voluntary furlough, and I'll talk a bit about furlough agreements and what you can offer staff. But we have found from experience across the task force that this is quite attractive. You know, for example, where you have staff that might be having childcare responsibilities, that may have a partner that, you know, needs to, whether they're in the NHS or otherwise, needs to continue working. So we are seeing, although it seems sort of counterintuitive to volunteer to be furloughed, we are seeing that there is a reasonable take-up of that across the industry. So again, if I just sort of conclude the kind of bottom track there, if you've still got a shortfall in you know, making up those positions at risk, say you only perhaps have 10 volunteers, but you know that you need to be looking at sort of 20, you can start to really unpick where you go from there. And that's where we've seen firms start to bring in sort of complementary initiatives, shall we say, or complementary interventions to bring their staff costs down around, you know, looking to reduce working hours, or have put in their compulsory furlough. Now, it's not widespread that is in employment contracts, but there are certain circumstances where you can do that. So, you know, if you are in a situation where perhaps you're not able to identify or have those volunteers, it is something that you can look at, but it's very specific set of circumstances. It will depend very much on the type of contract that you have in place. So that's sort of the way you would go if you weren't having to retain a certain level of capacity. Now, if I switch back to the blue box, you'll see, you know, if you are needing to be a little bit more selective about retaining a certain level of capacity, something that we've seen introduced, and this is quite common across manufacturing, where they're looking at actually needing to maintain a sort of minimum level of cover, whether it's for emergency call outs or whether it's for just keeping the factories turning over, but where they've actually scaled down production, or even in a consultancy business where perhaps you've got lower levels of staff utilization, but you've still got some critical work that needs to continue. So in those sorts of circumstances, we're seeing firms apply something we're calling a rolling furlough. So where we look at introducing this sort of 3-week on, 3-week off type furlough rotation. So the minimum amount of time at the moment that you can furlough somebody is 3 weeks. So effectively what you could do is bring, you know, part of your, say 10 of your engineers off for 3 weeks and then rotate them with another 10 for the next 3 weeks. And again, some firms are seeing that is a bit more palatable for their staff, because it sort of shares the sort of opportunity to be furloughed throughout the organisation. So again, needing to be careful that we maintain that sort of critical level of support for some of those activities where clients are determining that they're key workers, but still allowing that, you know, the business to take advantage of the fact that they aren't seeing the same fee levels, the same utilisation as they would do in a sort of business as usual environment. So that's a little bit of sort of condensed knowledge about what we're picking up in terms of how firms specifically in construction are applying these. Now, obviously that is for you to tailor to your own business, and it certainly isn't all the answers, but it's just to give you a flavour of, you know, some level of consistency across the industry with firms applying the new rules. And like I said, there is a much longer guidance note on that available. It's open to all, but on the Construction Leadership Council website. So just before I finish and take questions, I wanted to touch a little bit on some of the, again, perhaps construction sector specific nuances around furloughing. So one thing that comes up quite often is that 3 weeks is quite a long time to be on rotation. Perhaps, you know, particularly if you're looking at having staff who are, you know, have been demobilised from site, but actually, you know, have now sort of looked at the site risk assessment and are able to get back sooner, and you've got your staff all on a 3-week chunk of furlough, that is quite unhelpful. So the first point is we are discussing the length or the minimum length of time that you can furlough staff with the government. We don't have an answer yet, but we are hopeful that 3 weeks might be shortened to make the scheme more flexible. So more flexible in terms of being able to turn furloughed staff on and off. Perhaps it might come down to 2 weeks or even 1 week. But as it stands at the moment, it's 3 weeks. So that is something that we're pushing for through the task force, is a reduction in that to give greater flexibility on how it's applied. And then secondly, there's some interesting things coming out around what staff can do whilst on furlough. So I think this is particularly interesting, perhaps if people are furloughing some of their more junior staff, because the things that you can still do are anything that relates to not fee earning. So, for example, I know that there are some companies who are looking to make their agreements with their furloughed staff on the basis that they go on furlough, but actually the staff can still keep themselves occupied by doing things like their professional development or their work towards their chartership. So that can still be done while staff are on furlough. So again, thinking about how you sort of broker these deals, how you come to an agreement with your staff, it could be that actually they're able to do those sorts of things. So if they are, nervous or unsure about the business's commitment to them and feel a little bit uneasy about being put on furlough, there are things like being able to, to continue to support them through their professional development. You can also put them on training. So again, I know of some businesses that have actually sort of said, well, you can have the 3 weeks furlough, and to give you some confidence that we will call you back at the end of it, why don't we invest in you doing some training during that period? So again, they can do that during the period that they're on furlough. And lastly, they can actually volunteer as well. So again, I know that some of the firms are seeing the opportunity to try to help those that want to volunteer, maybe with some of these sort of NHS volunteering, or even just volunteering within their community. So again, all of that can be brought into the sort of discussions around, would you like to be furloughed, and some of the perhaps sort of agreements that can be brought into play when you're making that decision with staff. Because I must stress that unless you have a very specific clause in your contract, actually you're going to need to come to some sort of agreement. So some of those things will help to encourage your staff, I think, to volunteer to furlough, and also demonstrate that they are valued by the company as well. So that was everything I wanted to cover in terms of construction specific interpretations. I'm very happy to take questions, some of which I will be able to answer, some of which I might defer because I know that the answers are coming in later presentations, but I think I'll pause there and take questions.
Thanks very much, Hannah. It's a very useful, very interesting insight of the furloughing process that I think we're probably all experiencing at the moment. Just interesting, I mean, from my part, that I'm right in thinking, aren't I, that the furlough it extends till the end of May, is that correct?
It is at the moment, yes. And I think we're waiting to see, and I appreciate that's not actually that far away. So I think we're sort of waiting to see in terms of the lockdown restrictions that we know are going to be reconsidered by the government next week. I think at that point they will make a decision on whether or not they extend the scheme. I wouldn't like to comment on the likelihood of that, but I think that's when we'll see a decision. So if you're planning for it, I would suggest we would have a bit more visibility about whether it's going to carry on beyond the end of May in the next sort of 2 weeks.
So Hannah, I've got a question here from Farah, who is saying, if I have a member of staff on a temporary contract due to end next month, normally I would extend, but due to COVID, will this end? If I furlough, can this be indefinite, or for what period can I do furlough?
So if in ordinary, and I wait to be corrected by others, but my understanding is if you would ordinarily extend, you can put them on to furlough for the period that the scheme is in operation. So we've just mentioned that it would be until the end of May. The only caveat on that is that they need to have been on your payroll since the 28th of February. So if this is a temporary member of staff, provided they were on your payroll, that you were employing them before the 28th of February, you would be able to, or they would be eligible to be furloughed. Oh, I can't hear you, Stephen. Sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry, get used to technology. Yeah, so I have another one from Jan, who's saying, can employers force furloughed staff to do specific activities, e.g. training? I mean, I think you've touched on this. It's not about forcing, is it? But staff can actually do training whilst they're on furlough.
Yeah, absolutely. They can do training, they can do, preparing for their chartership, perhaps working on those competencies that nobody really does when they're working, that sort of thing they can do. And I think what's quite nice about this process is that it's done by agreement. So, you don't really want to be in a position where you're forcing, but actually, you can certainly sort of start to bring that in to the conversations about the agreement to furlough. And what staff will be doing. So I would see it more as a conversation rather than forcing them. But again, if you sort of approach that in the way that actually this is about us wanting to invest in you, perhaps, committing to investing in you as an individual to pay for training for you to undertake, I think perhaps you'd get to that, hopefully get to that agreement without having to force them.
Okay, and I've had another one here from Anthony, who's saying, can local authority staff be put on the scheme?
I'm gonna completely say I don't know that one. I'm going to defer to Michael, I think, who would probably have a better view.
Thank you, Hannah. So it's Michael Archer here. Yes, I believe public authorities can also put their employees on furlough, so they can participate as well.
Oh, Stephen, you're on mute again.
I have a question here from Sharon, who's saying we have a lot of SME limited companies in the industry with a sole director. Can they furlough themselves? And what work can directors do when on furlough? Yeah,
so this one was a late clarification, so they can furlough themselves. What you would be eligible for would be your salary. So if you're, you pay yourself a salary, that would be the sort of PAYE elements of that would be what you would be paid through the scheme. So you may see a reduction in your income, but you can furlough yourself. And the restrictions around your duties are that, you have to stick to your statutory duties, so your fiduciary duties as a director. You can't do fee earning, you can't do client facing work. You must just sort of do the bare minimum to keep the company solvent and make sure you're doing your sort of statutory duties on that basis. So I can see that'd be quite a difficult decision, but there is wider support open to SMEs that might help you to sort of secure alternative income that would make it easier if you did want to continue with client facing activities, because I can appreciate if you're a sole trader, that is a difficult decision to make.
And actually, here's an interesting question, which is about the concept of training. That if training eventually turns into a fee, into a fee-earning activity, would this restrict the notion of training?
So the guidance is very clear, and it does explicitly mention training. So I think the actual process of going on the training, the learning itself, is fine. If the idea is you then, take what you've learned from that and start to develop a fee earning, revenue stream, a proposal or similar, I'd see, as soon as it starts to switch from being on the training course into business development, I think that's the line that you cross. But it does explicitly mention training. So, the days that you're on a course, the times that you are actually attending structured training is absolutely fine.
Yeah, it's a very fine line, isn't there, really, between training and business development. So I have a question here about how many people in an organisation can be furloughed. I don't think there's a limit on this. I was listening to the conference call with the construction minister that Saint-Gobain have furloughed 11,000 members of staff, but I don't think there's a limit, is there, Hannah?
No, there's not a limit. The only thing that we've encountered in the construction industry is just recognising that when you furlough people at the moment, you can't bring them back for at least 3 weeks. So just recognising that, we need to, in some circumstances, maintain that minimum capability around essential works. So I think that's probably the only constraint that you'd see, really. Stephen? Can't hear you, Stephen.
Sorry. There's a question here from Walla saying annual leave may not be on top of the agenda, but any suggestions if an employer won't agree to carrying forward annual leave
So this is quite a challenging one, recognising that, as we say, if you've got 11,000 staff on furlough, you don't necessarily want them all accruing their annual leave. Some of the things that we have seen businesses do in this space is when they come to the furlough agreements, looking at, as part of that conversation, agreeing with staff how they might take annual leave. So it may be that you are, for example, agreeing to be furloughed for 3 weeks, and then immediately following that, take a week's annual leave. So we are seeing firms bringing that into the conversations with people. So obviously you can't force people to take annual leave. And I think there are some dispensations and flexibilities being introduced by the government to allow you to carry it forward to future years. But I think that's very much at the company's discretion. So again, I suggest that businesses have a think about how they apply that, to their particular set of circumstances. But we are seeing some that are bringing that into the conversation, shall we say, around furloughing.
Can I just chip in here on the holiday thing? So there has been an announcement about holiday in relation to the working time regulations minimum, and that has extended the period over which a carry forward can be taken over a period of 2. So that sort of cuts across the objectives of an employer, I would suggest at the moment, which is to ask those on furlough to please take their holiday while they're not doing anything. And I think there is a bit of a challenge there in the discussion between an employee and an employer as to what they want to do about it. And if there is a challenge like that, you can, under some circumstances and some contracts, insist on holiday being taken, but you have to give a notice to the employee of twice the period of their leave. If you require them to go on leave, take part of their furlough as leave. Hopefully those conversations are not going to be too difficult, because it is an area where there could be a falling out, I think.
Yeah.
And I have a couple of questions here about while staff are actually on furlough. The first question from Hayley, asking the question, is it possible to make staff redundant whilst they're on furlough? And then another one from Mark saying, whilst I have staff on furlough, can I employ new staff in a different role? For example, if they have a different skill set or indeed location.
Yeah, so the first one of those, around making staff redundant, again, I should probably bring Michael into this one, but my understanding is that you can't whilst they're on furlough, but when, as soon as their furlough ends, you could bring them back into a redundancy process. But is that your understanding, Michael?
Well, obviously the intention of this whole scheme is to save people's jobs and to avoid redundancy. But I touch upon that particular issue as to whether you can take some steps to prepare for future redundancies in the bit that I've got to say later. So it would cut across the aim of the scheme, I would say, if you're going to make people redundant who are on furlough. And as for bringing people in, well, if they're being brought in now, they wouldn't be on the payroll on the 28th of February, so they wouldn't, presumably, they wouldn't be eligible to be under the scheme. So don't think you can bring people in and then put them on furlough now, because that date is gone.
Yeah, and I think it's in terms of bringing staff in, I have heard that because obviously part of the decision to furlough and the reason we put that process in place was to help businesses with their rationale around who they furlough and why they furlough them. So you've got a sort of evidence trail, which may or may not be required by HMRC, but it's always best to have it and have some rationale behind it. So again, in terms of bringing in new employees, I think as long as you've got that sort of clear rationale about why you have made or furloughed certain members of your staff, perhaps it's a location, perhaps it's a skill set challenge. I think as long as you've got that detailed, and then you can say, this is why I've had to bring in different staff, because they're able to work in a different part of the country, because they're able to do a different sort of work that actually I have got a revenue stream for, then that is absolutely fine. But I would stress the need to be absolutely clear. And I think that not just for the HMRC's sake, actually for the staff's sake as well, because they may be confused and want to question it themselves. But if you've got that clear rationale, it just sort of stands you in good stead, I think. Okay. Right. Do we have any more questions, Stephen? Oh.
Shall I jump in quickly? There's a couple that haven't been mopped up. One of them was about business development. Can furloughed staff do business development as well as training when they're on furlough?
Yeah, so no, I don't believe they can do that. Certainly the interpretation of the guidance that we've looked at through the Construction Leadership Council. And Michael's nodding, so that
Yes,
must be true.
I absolutely agree with you, and I think companies have to be really, really careful about this. And of course, you don't know what the application when you make it is going to be asking, but it'll be clearly something that the HMRC will look at. And probably will want to see a declaration that nobody's actually been working even in those sorts of activities. So business development, no, I'm afraid not. That's likely to disqualify.
And then there's one more, I think. Can an employer top up the furlough pay by the remaining 20% to keep employees on their full salary level?
Yes, and you can top it up beyond that. It's just that there is a cap on the amount that the government will pay. So if actually you're furloughing, quite sort of high earning staff, you can top all the way up with the government just paying the sort of first. I think the cap's about £2,500, so they would pay that, and then you could, in principle, top up to the rest of the staff salary.
Okay, brilliant. Have we still got Stephen? Are you still on here, Stephen?
He doesn't seem to be here, Maria. So
okay, right. Well,
if you could.
That's fine. Okay, so well, thank you very much for that, Hannah. That was brilliant. We had a comment as well to say thank you so much from Alexander. Very useful presentation. Thank you for the clarity you've brought to furloughing team members. The great thing about developing team is that it can really present an opportunity to upskill. So a really positive comment there. So thank you very much. Okay, so we're now moving on to Stephen Corbett, who's Head of Client Solutions at Capita. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much. First of all, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody's keeping fit and well, first of all, and that's the most important thing to say. Thank you very much indeed for you guys for inviting me on the conference. The reason Capita are talking this afternoon is because it was a conversation we had kind of online, as you do, with Graham Watts in regards to the industry, the task force, some ideas about what to take to government, some good news stories, what the workforce is doing, who's been affected. So it was a conversation with Graham, first of all. And I think Hannah's touched on this already around training and furloughs and general workforce issues. So I work for Capita in the people solutions business in the resourcing arm. So as you expect, that's everything to do with access to skills, managing workforces, contingent off payroll, contract, to really drive UK PLC to unlock the business potential that we have. We were doing a lot before COVID-19 hit us. And funnily enough, we're doing quite a lot more now it has hit us, which my colleagues can go into. Dave Hannah and Alan Herbert are on the call as well. But it was a conversation with Graham Watts really around what Capita were doing in terms of some government initiatives. We obviously serve the private and the public sector. Some good news stories around work around the NHS, which I may leave to Dave to highlight. A very kind of high level in regards to the workforce exchange program, and I don't want to drop Dave in it because the government is still kind of working very quickly and it's a moving picture in terms of what that is. But yeah, Capita in the resource and people solutions business manages large workforces for various industries. Employee engagement, talent programs, talent acquisition, resourcing, as I say. One of the interesting things we're seeing at the moment is what the market is doing right now, because I think we're all being affected by furloughs, by the economy kind of coming to a slow grind, projects being stopped. But also, I think it's quite important to keep an eye on exit plans. in terms of when the market and the economy and the world gets switched back on, where our workforce is going to be. How are we going to get back up to speed? How are we going to re-vet, recheck, re-onboard people? How are we going to manage those workforces? Are they going to have to be shared workforces? Or we have to go into partnerships with each other? So there's a kind of growing piece in terms of what Capita are getting involved in. In terms of one aspect of training we just spoke about there, I don't by any means turn this into a sales call, but Capita owns the Fire Service College in Morton in the Marsh. We've seen some interest there because we've just developed a suite of courses aligned with CSCS, Construction Skills Certification Scheme, in terms of online courses there as well. So my colleague's going to go on to how we keep furloughed staff engaged, trained, the latest CPDs, ready for when the world gets switched on again. So there's a number of things that Capita are working towards at the moment. If I can introduce a colleague, Dave Hannah, who's the Managing Director of our People Solutions business. Perhaps, Dave, you could just speak very high level around the work we've done for the NHS, their returners. There's going to be a big piece of work around returning workforces. And then maybe just touch on the workforce exchange program, high level, just in terms of what that looks like there. And then maybe, Alan, you can follow up.
Yep, no problem. Thank you. And hello, everybody. As you've said there, you've covered off the Capita piece. What I'll probably do is very quickly give you what I think is probably of most interest here, which is talking about, I suppose, the next piece. We've covered off here, how do you make the decisions about furloughing and make a decision which elements of your workforce you potentially want to furlough. The next step of the process, I suppose, is, as Steve's touched on there, what happens then when we have a large organisation? There's lots of big numbers flying around the press at the moment, the numbers of people across the entire economy that could potentially be furloughed here. You know, it's in the many millions of workers, huge variety of skill sets. What do we do? So the thinking at the moment, and as you've caveated already, I can't go into too much detail because I don't want to overcommit here. Government is looking at this. We are working very closely with the Cabinet Office and other partners to shape a workforce exchange program, with the intention being, how do you understand in an agile manner the makeup of supply and demand in the economy at any given time? So there is an expectation that skills in certain areas will be released and furloughed. However, and it's a very, very fast-moving, dynamic scenario at the moment, you may well find that need arises very quickly with very clear demand of certain skills. So what we are working with government with, and we're hoping for an announcement in the very near future about how this will roll out. And we're already in play in terms of building the infrastructure behind this to switch it on very quickly, will be in essence, a matching system to understand how we can quickly put supply and demand together. So if you are a company that has released a set of skills into the marketplace, there will be a way for potentially those skills to be highlighted, picked up and matched against someone else who requires those skills in the short term, with the obvious need here being, we are trying as best we can to maximize economic activity through the downturn, to minimize the impact of furlough, with an overarching need here essentially to try and keep businesses whole. So if you go back to that workflow chart that Hannah took us through, it's really understanding at what stage can you make a decision about the skills that you're likely to release. Because in the perfect scenario, what we'd like to do is actually have a scenario where you don't need to release anybody to furlough. You could well match those latent skills against a piece of incoming business and effectively work with another organisation to make sure that your skills, rather than furloughing, are actually applied to their need. Or if we don't get it quite at that point, then there is still the point that once you've furloughed, there is the ability around the rules of furlough. Obviously, we do have this 3-week period and working out how quickly we can transition furloughed skills back into the workforce. But it may well be, if this does go on to the longer term, rather than going into that next iteration, the next 3 weeks and the next 3 weeks, there may be a way to quickly switch those skills back on, bring them back in, but not necessarily into your business, but actually move them into pieces of work for other organizations. So that is the principle behind this. There is a lot of detail obviously behind that, how that's going to function. The expectation at the moment is there will be a national level infrastructure, which is what Capita has been asked to work with government on, in terms of how do we quickly and simply capture supply and demand at the national level. and also put in place a matching system to make that as efficient as possible, so we can then communicate that out to the companies that are affected. The expectation at the moment is, again, to keep this simplicity moving, is that it will be delivered through a network of regional structures. So there'll be a national sort of catcher of supply and demand, and then probably operating at a regional level, there will be entities whose job it will be at a very local level to put together organizations. And there is an expectation here. We are not trying to create a huge behemoth structure here that tries to organize and take over the role of the free market, if you like, in terms of doing this. So the expectation will still be that it's an introductory type service. If you have certain skills that are available in the market and someone in that region needs those skills, it will be a way for somebody with a helicopter view of the supply and demand across the region and the nation can put those two companies together to talk to one another, with the expectation that government will build some guidelines around how that interaction happens, which is another area of detail we don't know yet in terms of how those skills will move between organisations. So I suppose that's to just put on everyone's radar that there will be another piece, hopefully, when it all gets signed off, will be another piece beyond the act of furloughing, which hopefully will help us understand how we can most effectively get those skills back into productive work. In addition to that, that's relying on government coming in and doing certain things. I suppose the other piece to point out is that we as an organisation are already having these types of conversations in a more private environment, because actually my argument would be there will always be a need for critical labour, and what we need to do is work with industry and groups like this to understand within given sort of trade areas what are the critical skills that we would see coming up, because you have on the one hand a challenge around how do I furlough excess skills in the current market. We will also at some point, and in certain industries, have a challenge around you may well have skills that you're very keen to retain, but you may lose those skills from your workforce due to sickness and everything else. So there's another piece to this that Steve touched on about working together to share critical skills through an industry or through a sector in a way that it allows all of those industries to keep functioning and keep effective. So if you do have certain critical skill sets that in your particular instance you are dropping below critical level, we will help using pretty much the same functionality actually that we're talking about at this workforce exchange level to help companies who want to be part of shared work groups to share those resources effectively amongst each other. So I suppose there's two parts to us. We are heavily engaged with government to build that national picture, and as soon as we have more, obviously we can pass that back through this organisation to explain how that works and how we can quickly get that set up. There's also probably another question around could we also do some work around helping organisations share critical skills, and equally topping up those critical skills as well if they are not available across the sector. How else do we find them? And that gets us onto the point we touched on about returners. The most high profile, I'm sure everybody is aware of, obviously, is returners back into the NHS. How do you identify critical skills in that instance and pull them back in at speed with all the various checks and requirements that need to happen to make those people effective? And we are doing a huge piece of work currently with the NHS, assisting them in bringing back currently it grows every day, but certainly 20,000 plus ex-clinicians that are being brought back at speed, and our expectation is that same need will happen across a number of industries as we work through this crisis, and as things, if we do go into a sharp V recession, a shallow U, and this goes on for a period of time and sickness does take effect, we will also be able to stand up activities around attracting returners back from critical skill sets, vetting them, making them available within this pool. And our vision would be we'd probably have a scenario where we agree with industry what skills are critical. We work with the constituent members to track and manage those critical skills in a shared pool that can be accessible to anyone who requests. And equally, we can top up that pool from a returner program to make sure that ex-engineers with particular skills who are available and are able to be brought back into the market, we can run those attraction campaigns, we can run the vetting campaigns and make those people available as well. So that's really, I suppose, where Capita is focusing, and how we can assist in this at the moment is using that knowledge of attraction, vetting, and skills access to help industry to get through this, as well as obviously working with government to facilitate whatever they do end up creating at that national level. I hope that's kind of my brief, I think, for today, just to sort of set the scene. And apologies, I don't have more detail. I would love to share more. There is more detail behind that. We've been working pretty aggressively over the last 10 days to build tech stacks and processes behind this to allow us to switch it on quickly. But we're just not in a position to really go into any more detail yet until government makes its sort of final decisions about how this looks and when it arrives.
Great stuff. Thanks, Dave. Alan, can you kind of take us home in terms of probably looping back into what Hannah was talking about, what we've been discussed already around furloughed members, keeping them engaged, keeping them trained, accredited, and that kind of things as well?
Yeah, that's no problem at all. Maria, can you pop up my first slide? Good afternoon, everybody. So just wait for that first slide to come onto the screen if we can from Maria.
Are you able to share your screen, or did you want?
If you could run it, just 2 slides, please, Maria. The first slide would be great.
Let me just add. I'm not sure if I've got it to hand at the moment.
So I think just while we're waiting for that to happen, one of the key areas that my team deal with is auditing, which I know is a delight to everybody, health and safety auditing. And I wanted to just outline a case study where we've moved into a very agile situation to really step up and deliver. So we run on behalf of the Railway Safety Standards Board the risks audit scheme, which some of you will be familiar with. This is the rail industry's supplier qualification scheme. It provides safety assurance to 110 buyers. Those 110 buyers include Network Rail and TfL, and it consists of over 4,300 contractors. Our role is to audit their safety management system, and because it's rail, that's an essential service. So as COVID-19 began to emerge, we started to prepare a mitigation plan to deliver audits in a different way. Our auditing has always been face-to-face, between 1 and 5 days at a contractor's site. So we looked to move to a virtual audit. We undertook a risk assessment. We looked at options. We completed tests and piloting the week of the 16th of March, and we introduced over a phased period of time the agile auditing, which was delivered through Microsoft Teams. What's interesting about this is that we were not face-to-face with our people that we were auditing. So we had to provide an awful lot more in the way of communication in advance of the audits. And I would think most of the companies that we were auditing were fairly nervous that we would, instead of be spending between 1 and 5 days with them, it would all be on the end of a computer screen. But the pilots went pretty well. The workforce from our side of things that were involved in the pilots were our vulnerable workforce. So we had a number of people that couldn't go out. So they formed the first team, worked really well. Broadband and Microsoft Teams stood up well. Really good timetables were put together so that there were gaps in activity to make the audit more palatable. We completed in the first week and a half 120 audits out of 133. The small failure rate was due principally to contractor sickness. Results and supplier feedback were really good. So that's continuing, and we are pleased with how we have managed to move to a much more agile auditing workforce. Moving forward, my safety team is now looking at, if you like, our post-lockdown remobilisation and what we intend to do going forward. clearly collaborative working is really, really impressive at the moment in my mind. The conference calling, WebEx, Teams, and all this interaction with colleagues is great, and I think that's really good for planning and the design phase of projects, and we believe that work should be continuing at pace so that new projects can hit the ground fast. We do see there's an area for development in this pre-remobilisation phase. I think we've got to look very carefully at PPE, the need for social distancing on sites, decontamination protocols, and then moving forward, looking at how folk will be identified as vulnerable, and maybe passporting or similar for folk that have developed resistance. I think these are all areas that are going to emerge over the next 2 or 3 weeks. Clearly, organisations that need to be looking very carefully at their hygiene arrangements and restrictions on groupings as far as social distancing is concerned, and looking at their plans for future travel, because I think future travel, some options will be limited. Our thoughts are obviously to sit with clients and to review very carefully programs and lead-in times. Many issues with materials from abroad and delays that may be expected there. And then we return to the subject of resource, the need to really communicate with staff whilst they are in the furlough period. I think we've all identified, every speaker has spoken about the skills and knowledge of the workforce, but communicating with that workforce during this 3-week or longer period is absolutely imperative. We see that moving forward as people are becoming isolated, their mental health, and well-being, and there is a big role for mental health first aiders and line managers in dealing with these areas. So social isolation and the direct impact of the virus on people's family are issues that really need to be programmed in to return to work. Probably as well to look at those staff that are in financial hardship as well. This is going to have an impact, and this may have an impact on individuals' appetite for risk, and they may be less risk averse, which could clearly affect a site. So there's a whole host of areas to look at here with the employer's duties under the Health and Safety at Work Act. They obviously need for preparing for risk assessments. We've spoken earlier about training and induction and reinduction of staff, emergency preparedness, reviews of the safety management systems, client duties under the CDM, particularly the welfare provisions, and finally the most recent changes in the RIDDOR regulations, which in certain circumstances in the workplace are making coronavirus as an identified illness reportable. So I think there are lots of things that we're looking at and working with our clients to drive forward so that we are productive in this fallow period and really effective in our rapid remobilisation when lockdown starts to ease up. So thank you very much there.
Thanks, Alan. So that's it from Capita. Thank you very much, Steve, for inviting us. If you have any questions, we'd like to try and answer them as best we can. It's, as you probably understand, it's still a moving picture for all of us. But if there's anything we can help with or answer now, we're more than happy to share some knowledge.
Thanks, Steve, Dave and Alan, and apologies as problems with technology, my computer crashed, but I'm now back online. I've got a couple of questions from Stephen, actually, who's asking whether or not the sort of workforce exchange program how that applies to SMEs, and what is the likely timescale?
Yep. So good question. So likely timescale, I can't give an accurate one on that, purely because it will be a government decision about when and how to do this. All I can say is that we have been working through in readiness for this. So I suppose the answer from our perspective in terms of how quickly we could stand things up, we are talking days rather than weeks. For that perspective, it really does come down to a decision from government about how they intend to work in this space, I suppose, and how they actually want to help organisations share that furloughed resource. With regard to the aspect of the SME, I think technically it's applicable across the piece. We certainly, when we're building the structure, are not making any distinction between the number of skills that are available in any particular area. The system can just as easily cope with one person as it can with 1,000 people. The idea, and I did see, I think in some comments elsewhere, to be really key here, this is about speed and efficiency of just moving through and matching supply and demand. So we are looking at capturing pretty high level macro information around this. I think that the question was about sharing of sensitive data around employees and things like that. There is not an expectation that at this exchange level that we are getting into those types of conversations. It's really just trying to understand as quickly as we can the types and the number of skills that are available in any particular given area, so that we can then put interested parties together to probably get down into that layer of detail around how resources are shared. There was another question, I think, as well. Sorry, I'm jumping around. I kind of read ahead, but that was talking about, is it possible to share furloughed resources, for example, between companies? And again, I will certainly defer that to some of the legal heads on this call rather than me, but I know that there is thought and there is work going into that in terms of how do you make that happen? How do you loan, second, whatever the term may be, how do we make that piece happen? So that's, again, is stuff that is being thought through and understood. I suppose I can stress from our perspective as Capita, and our role in any potential exchange is about how do we understand and capture supply, demand and skills data quickly and match them quickly and get that information down to the local level as fast as we can, so that those conversations can take place. And again, that is just as applicable for SMEs. One of the key things, I think, because it is designed to be a bottom-up, regionally focused piece of activity, it does allow for those smaller firms to, at a regional level, be very much in the conversation and be part of the solutions for firms, as well as also balancing that with obviously looking at the national picture with larger firms and how that can be accommodated. So hopefully that answers a couple of questions.
I have a question here from Paul. I don't know whether any one of you the three of you can answer this. Is that he would appreciate a comment being made about contractor experts working for international engineering outside their home countries. He's in Sierra Leone, from Uganda, working for an Italian company on a project funded by the EDF. Is that something that either of you can comment on?
I'd have to bow to Dave for that one, I think.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of pieces in that puzzle, isn't there? I suppose the only thing I can say is at the moment we are looking at this as a view of a UK government-run program to support UK firms through the very specific UK furloughing program. So I don't know is the simple answer. There is complexity in there that I wouldn't like to answer on this call about how that would be pieced together.
Okay.
Because I think a lot of it will probably come down to ultimately where the company is registered and where they're working, and how that then applies in that company's own equivalent kind of furlough and job retention support schemes that are going on, would be my gut feel. But yeah, I probably couldn't say much more than that.
Okay, and just to conclude this part of the webinar, I'd just like to bring in Graham Watts, who's the Chief Executive of CIC. Graham, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow on from David, really, because I'm sure a lot of people out there will be wondering what the current situation is with the site operating procedures, because David was talking about working on sites. And the current position is that Public Health England produced new guidance late last night. If you haven't already seen that, you can see it not only on the PHE website and the Health and Safety Executive website, but also through Build UK, CIC, CLC, AC. I'm sure we've probably all got it on our websites now. But what's happening as a result of that is that the Construction Leadership Council is producing a third version of the site operating procedures, bearing in mind that the second one was pulled. So it's the first version that is still applying, and they hope to publish that third version sometime early next week, Tuesday or Wednesday. The new guidance from PHE is more detailed. It goes into areas such as carpooling, for example. The other issue which a lot of people are asking questions about, which might be worth mentioning here, is the situation with the devolved administrations, and construction policy is a devolved responsibility, and it is unfortunate but nonetheless true that Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have all produced policies which are not only different as between themselves, but certainly not in line with the policy being advocated by Public Health England and by the UK government. So that's just a quick update.
Thanks for that, Graham. I think I'd like to move on now to our next panellist, who is Andrew Snowden from UHY Hacker Young, who's going to talk about the financial and accountancy aspects of the government schemes. Can I hand over to you, Andrew?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully. So we're going to go back to the job retention scheme and just look at the financial nuts and bolts. As a tax partner in UHY, I'm very used to dealing with new legislation, new ideas, and having to sort of almost advise on those on the hoof at times before full details have emerged. But I have to say, even by the speed of some things that have happened in the past, this one probably beats all, in the sense that no sooner has the ink dried on the first version than we're putting it into practice, where we're taking specific action as employers of various businesses, and then the rules are slightly changing and things are slightly moving on. So we're going to just look at one or two things there, but I just want to sort of go really through the numbers. So apologies if some of you are all over this already in terms of how the thing works, but I think it's probably useful just to have a look at the overview of this, which is that this is, as mentioned already, a scheme which is designed to stop businesses laying people off, giving business breathing space so that they can actually continue to stay in existence and not make employees redundant. So the concept is that you can claim as a business, as an employer, 80% of your employees' wage costs for those who are furloughed by their firms. And I'm sure, like so many other people, you've probably never heard even of the term furlough before all of this started. I certainly hadn't either, but now it's probably the word I've used almost more than anything over the last 2 or 3 weeks. It's based on the usual monthly wage, which we'll look at in a moment. And there's a cap, as again mentioned, of £2,500 per calendar month for each employee that is furloughed. But added to that cap is also the relevant part of the employer's national insurance contributions and the auto-enrollment pension contribution that he makes in respect of that furloughed employee. So it would only be up to either the amount that they're paying or the cap itself. You can use it any time during the whole process. So as again, we've heard, these are in 3-week cycles, minimum of 3-week cycles, although I am expecting at some point, I've no doubts that the 3 weeks will come down, but I'm also expecting that the time limit taken to the end of May will also be increased. You can choose to top up the salary, but in the words of HMRC, you do not have to. And I think that one is going to be quite an interesting point of employment law that we're going to have to be looking at and probably dealing with the consequences of for months or years to come. But I'm going to, as I'm not an employment lawyer, I'm going to skirt around that and leave that one alone. But I think it is just worth saying, and just following up from some of the discussions earlier, it's just worth saying that I've got no doubt that when all of this dies down and we go back to doing what we do, and we put all of this in the past, there's going to be months or years of HMRC audits and inquiries into how businesses have operated furloughs. So it's really, really important that you get everything exactly right in terms of the employment law procedures as well as the amounts that you can actually claim, because HMRC, despite the best intentions at the moment of why this has been put in place, they are going to look at every single claim and certainly pick the large ones and start working their way through them to make sure that no untoward action has actually happened. So how does the grant actually work? Well, it's the lower of 80% of what's deemed to be the regular wage, or £2,500. This sum, the actual sum we're talking about, must actually, of course, be paid to the employee. And then on top of that, as we mentioned, the employer's national insurance contributions to the extent of that sum, that grant, and the auto-enrolment employer's contribution if the employee hasn't opted out of auto-enrolment, in other words, has his own pension arrangements and doesn't want to be involved in the business. That would have happened or not have happened. And that's a maximum mandatory level of 3%. And the employer's NI, of course, is 13.8%. And this excludes all fees, commission and bonuses. And that line is there because up to a few days ago, that's all we had. That was the sum total of the guidance. And as I mentioned earlier, what we're seeing now is a continuous process of updates and clarifications as to what works, what doesn't work, how it works. And this one has already been supposedly clarified, which is that it includes, so wages, the definition of wages includes regular wages, overtime, fees, and compulsory commission. It excludes discretionary bonuses, tips, benefits in kind, and quite interestingly, salary sacrifice. And I say that last point because a lot of arrangements have already been put in place. It does involve having discussions with your employees, and there's no doubt that employees in a lot of cases, in most cases, will already have assigned new arrangements or done it by email. However they've done it, they would already have made arrangements that probably include the salary sacrifice. So the most important one, I guess, is probably pension contributions. And so if you have an employee that puts the large proportion of his wages into salary sacrifice, then there's a big question there as to, well, what should he have done? Should this 80% actually have related to just the cash amounts that he gets from his employer? So he may well be losing out by effectively agreeing 80% with that salary sacrifice. So there's a big sort of problem there, I think, actually brewing. Benefits should continue unless agreed otherwise. Again, same point as before. So if you have, for example, a company car, if there's such a thing still exists these days, if you have a company car, then that will continue to be made available to you. The other point, just going back to salary sacrifice again, is that coronavirus has been agreed to be what's called a life event, and that actually means that it's a point in time when you can actually rearrange the arrangements you've put in place already. You can't just chop and change with salary sacrifices. You can only do it at certain key pre-agreed times, and one of these is now coronavirus. So an opportunity there for all employees just to reconsider how their wages should be structured if they have that opportunity in the future. So a couple of examples to try and, in case anything isn't clear here, I've just taken still relatively simple examples, but two employees situations. So we've got an employee in the first box, on the left box, of earning 42,000 a year. 80% of his monthly wage is going to be £2,800. So in that situation, his amount will be, or rather the employer's amount, because this isn't necessarily what happens to him, the grant that the employer will receive for that employee is £2,500, the capped amount. And then on top of that, as I mentioned, the 13.8% employer's national insurance contributions. So in that instance, that would be £345. And then on top of that, the auto enrolment contribution, assuming he's not opted out, of 3%. So that would be £75. So that would give you, in that instance, a total grant of £2,920 a month during the furlough period. Of course, the furlough isn't a month, it's 3 weeks possibly. And I know there are a number of organisations I've dealt with who are actually using 3-week periods and then sending them back in again. That's the concept. So they're going to have to prorate those amounts to come up with the relevant number. In the second example, this employee will earn £24,000, £2,000 a month. So his 80% would be, in that instance, £1,600. So that would be the relevant amount plus the employer's NICs and the 3% AE. So that would be a total grant of £1,869 per month during furlough. And then we deal with the situation where the employee has variable pay, where the whole thing gets a lot more complicated. And the three concepts here, that if the employee has already completed 12 months service, then you take the higher of the same month's earnings from the previous year, or the average monthly earnings during 2019-20, which is actually beyond the February cutoff point, of course. And so there's the highest of those two amounts would actually then be the relevant amount that you'd calculate and take for the purpose of calculating how the furlough would work. If he's been there less than 12 months, and bearing in mind he has to have been there by February the 28th, and that just as an aside there, that February is, of course, or 2020 rather, is a leap year. So it's February the 29th was actually a Saturday, just in case you were wondering. But if he's been there less than 12 months, then it's the average of his monthly earnings since his employment started. And if he only started in February 2020, which is, as we said, the latest that you could possibly take into account, then you'd use the pro rata for the earnings so far. Hopefully that made sense as a quick run through there. I think that's because I know that Michael is going to start talking about the very point that I think I've probably spent more time talking about myself with clients, which is actually when you can and can't do a furlough with individuals. But and I think that's probably the key thing that everybody's trying to discuss at the moment. But I think it's also worth just mentioning in passing just some of the other, I don't have slides for this, but just some of the other areas where the government, I mean, there's a huge raft of areas that are actually out at the moment, and time doesn't permit me to go through all of those. But one of them is the deferral of VAT. Sure, you're aware of that. So if you've got a VAT bill, one of your quarterly bills come up between the 20th of March and the 30th of June 2020, you can defer that payment to 31st of March 2021. It isn't going away, so you've really got to be in very, very good control of your cash flow if you're doing all of this, because with all of these things, they're fantastic, but it will catch up eventually. It doesn't take away the need to file the return. You've still got to do the filing. So the usual compliance that you've got to face will continue nevertheless. Something very, very similar with the self-assessment for those who aren't running in companies, self-assessment payments, that the July 20 payment can actually go to 31st of January 2021. The HMRC time to pay, something that's wheeled out every now and again, is now out again. And that's an opportunity to look at all of the other bills, the ones that aren't specifically covered where there's automatic deferral mechanisms, as there is, for example, with VAT, where you just simply have to file a return but not pay the VAT. But with time to pay on other things, it might be your PAYE bill, it could be your corporation tax quarterly installments. If you can show a hardship case, and I'm sure that right now most businesses are doing exactly that, or certainly anticipating a hardship case, then that is the sort of the next process to start arranging time to pay and moving back your liabilities. The caveat to that, and the big warning is good luck. We're trying to get through to the revenue. I have been doing it on behalf of others, and it has taken me forever. And actually found in the end, the only time I could actually get an answer was actually on Saturday. So that just no doubt if I tell too many people that won't be possible either, but just be aware of that. And then just to almost throw with it, I mean, obviously there's the business interruption loan scheme, which has to go through a recognised bank, and there are movements going on there, and things are changing on there all the time. The small loans are up to 5 million if your turnover is up to 45 million, and beyond that up to 25 million pounds of loans. But I won't go through the nuts and bolts of that because time doesn't permit. Just want to mention one email I got just before this webinar actually started, which is from the revenue, with a sort of hot off the press update, which is that the claim for job retention scheme actually will now take place on the 20th of April. It does seem that certain organisations acting for clients may not be able to actually use it. Payroll bureaus, where they're using what's called file only, may not be able to. But if your accountant is actually doing it as part of an overall service, it appears that we can. Now that's one very bland email, so I'm afraid that it's minor detail. And I suppose just before I completely stop talking, which is any moment now, the other thing is just be aware, and it's an ongoing point, that construction companies, those who are running construction, it's amazing how many of them are actually able to take advantage of R&D tax credits and get cashback claims if they're making losses. So a lot of them don't realise they are doing R&D, and it is just worth bearing that in mind and looking at that, because I've done a number for construction companies, just worth just looking at what you do to see whether in fact that's another way of raising relatively quite easy money. So I think with that, I'll pass back to Stephen to, and I think we're moving on to Michael actually. So let me just get back out of there if I can.
Thank you, Andrew, for a very clear presentation. I'd reiterate the point that you made at the end there about research and development credit. Certainly, in practice, that's something that we recently engaged with. Now, I'd like to bring in Michael Archer at this point, who's a partner at Beale and Co, who's going to talk about the employment law aspects, and then I'd like to the Q&A session can then be in respect of Andrew's presentation just now, can then follow. Michael.
Thank you very much. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Archer, partner in Beale & Co, a law firm with a special interest in construction. I'm an employment and business lawyer. In this short introduction, I'm going to look at a few of the legal challenges that employers face where they want to take advantage of the job retention scheme to receive grants from the government. And you've heard from Andrew about the main features of the scheme, the requirement for staff to be furloughed so as to be eligible to access the grant money to support the payments of their salary. In the employment law context, there are a number of legal niceties for employers to observe and some difficult issues thrown up by the rules of the scheme. On the slide, which I hope you can now see, I flagged up a selection of these. So first of all, which employers are eligible? Is it as simple as saying every employer is eligible? Can it really be as generous as that? When announced, it seemed to require evidence of hardship. If you cannot retain your current workforce, it was said. It was said to be designed to support employers whose operations had been severely affected by COVID-19. But then the government more recently has clarified this by saying all employers are eligible to claim under the scheme, and the government recognises that different businesses will face different impacts from coronavirus. That is an important condition. There is an important condition if we were looking at the scheme of its equivalent in the Republic of Ireland, where you do have to prove hardship, but that seems to not be applicable with the UK scheme. You just wonder whether some element, though, of subjective assessment, perhaps to the extent or severity of the downturn in business actually suffered by the employer will be made at some point, given the ambiguity in some of these announcements. The scheme, of course, has to be paid for by someone in the end. A second point I want to raise is which employees' salaries are covered. Well, the answer has been given of those on the payroll on the 28th of February. But some, as we know, have lost their jobs already. They've been made redundant or have been terminated for other reasons, or themselves have resigned for other reasons. And perhaps they were not eligible to receive a redundancy payment. Perhaps some resigned, but their new job did not materialize. The scheme says that these people can be rehired, presumably on the basis that they might actually have a longer term future. But that is very unlikely to be the case, I would suggest. So employers who are thinking of rehiring in these circumstances need to think very carefully about it. It would surely not be on the same terms as the previous contract, and their employment must be really on a temporary basis while they remained eligible for the scheme and would terminate as soon as they were not. These new and different terms of employment will need to be spelled out very clearly. The third issue is it legal to backdate? Usually my answer to this question would be a categoric no. I've advised clients in all sorts of commercial arrangements that this can never be done. But here we have more than a suggestion from the Chancellor that it is permitted. Quite extraordinary. He announced the furlough scheme on the 20th of March, when very few people, lawyers included, knew what furlough was, let alone had come across an example. Not one employee would have agreed a furlough arrangement at that time. And here we have the Chancellor inviting employers to treat arrangements with their employees as if they had agreed to such arrangements on or before the 1st of March. The government guidance to employees says, for example, the grant will start on the day you were placed on furlough, and this can be backdated to the 1st of March. I do have, however, think this is very dangerous. How far does it go? Can arrangements agreed with employees now, not just those employees who had no work to do from the 1st of March, be backdated? If they are not backdated, it does mean that a whole month of the 3-month scheme has been lost already. Some employers slow off the mark will have lost 1/3 of the available grant money. I could never bring myself to advise as a legal advisor to backdating, but the right advice must be make your decisions on furlough now before more time is lost. Fourth slide is, the fourth topic is, can you force somebody to be furloughed? And we know it requires the employee's agreement. But of course, agreement can be procured by all sorts of pressure. Is the threat to be laid off now, unless the furlough is agreed, appropriate? It is often the reality. So the answer is to approach it as you would a redundancy process. Explain the financial difficulties and seek volunteers first. If you have to decide between those who will continue to work and those who will go on furlough, you'll need to think about implementing a fair procedure for selection for furlough. There's a good place for good communication with employees over this. Many employees know the commercial realities, and if you explain what you're doing and why you're doing it, they're much more likely to understand and accept the decision. How do you carry out a fair selection? If you have to choose some but not all, you should adopt, again, similar principles to compulsory redundancy, appropriate pooling of employees, fair criteria for selection, apply the criteria objectively, avoiding discrimination, and keep records not only of this process, but the thinking behind it. Unlike redundancy, furlough is for a temporary period. And there may be good reasons why you need certain key workers to continue to work in this period, which might not apply to others. Is collective consultation needed? For large employers, if you're dealing with 20 or more employees by putting them on furlough, then you may also have to carry out collective consultation. The problem stems from the fact that if you say to your employees, please accept the furlough terms or else we will have to make you redundant, this then requires you, if more than 20 employees are affected, to inform and consult employee representatives and then notify the Secretary of State, even if all you wanted to do was to put everyone on furlough. That consultation will bring in delays to the process. So if the number of employees are between 20 and 99 in a 90-day period from the same establishment, there's a 30-day consultation, and for employees numbering over 100, there's a 45-day consultation period. So that's a period of 6.5 weeks. So that basically the furlough period will have been eaten up if you get caught up in a collective consultation. If you don't have employee representatives, and these are the numbers of potential redundancies you're talking about, then there's going to be more delay in getting those representatives balloted and elected. So for many employers who are dealing with a sizable workforce, they'll want to avoid this, as otherwise the whole retention scheme will have expired before they can access it. The answer is to deal with furlough on its own without making it a take it or leave it threat, which would otherwise require you to consult. Instead, rely on your ability to persuade your staff that accepting the terms of furlough being offered is in everyone's long-term interests. And the final point I just want to raise is, does this simply delay redundancy? Is it putting off the inevitable? Well, it depends on your view as to how quickly we can all get out of this and what the state of the economy will be when the restrictions are lifted. Given what I've said about the delays inherent in conducting large-scale redundancy programs, it ought to be prudent to start preparing now, if not implementing now, the selection for redundancy, even while employees are on furlough. Tough though that may sound, that there are also other cost-cutting measures that should be explored, such as requesting volunteers for redundancy, short-time or part-time working, pay reductions, sabbaticals and the like. These should be raised with staff during your communications with them. Again, good communication goes a long way to avoid alienating your staff. So those are, I think, some of the selection of some of the issues that are thrown up by this scheme. And I'm sure they have given rise to a number of others, and you might as well also have questions arising from some of the areas of uncertainty. So with that, I'm happy to join in and answer whatever questions you have. So.
Thank you, Michael. And I'd just like to, we have sort of just about half an hour left of this webinar. I'd like to now open it up to questions both for Andrew and Michael. We've had one by email saying, can staff returning from maternity leave and sick leave be furloughed with their consent, especially if they're unable to work from home? For example, if there's a lack of facilities or so. Who would like to take that? Taking maternity leave, so they're coming back from maternity leave and there is actually no job to go to because presumably the workplace is closed. I think with both categories, somebody who is a returning mother and somebody who's returning from sickness, you need to be careful that you're not treating them as being special cases. So if you're jumping to a conclusion that they're a returning mother, for example, we haven't got the work for them, let's put them on furlough,
and make that sort of assumption. That isn't an appropriate way of looking at a selection if they are being treated as a special case and being the only one going on furlough. But I think in both of those cases, one needs to be really careful and cautious about how you treat them, because potentially there are discrimination issues circling around any decision making you make there.
Thanks, Michael. And presumably someone who is on furlough cannot work for another firm.
Well, you can actually.
Yes, you can. Yeah.
Yes, if you've got two contracts of employment, you can have one that's furloughed and one that isn't. And so that is quite permitted. Obviously, the one where you're furloughed, you can't be working, so no duties for that employer can be carried out. But the duties for the other employer where you're not furloughed and you have work to do, yes, that can continue.
I think that was clarified last week in HMRC's guidance as well, that if you wanted to go off and work, if it's still possible to get work in this environment on a checkout or wherever else, then yes, you can do that while you're still on furlough with another employer.
Okay, thanks for that. So I've had quite a few questions here. One from Matthew saying, is there any official commentary on what does or does not count as non-fee earning work? I don't think there is guidance.
No, the guidance is quite vague, and it doesn't get any more specific than that, unfortunately. So the guidance that was issued, I think the original guidance from HMRC just touched over that, but it doesn't get into specific examples.
And from Danny, what level of pension contributions are recoverable through furlough?
From the employer's point of view, from the grant, that would be the 3% mandatory contribution that they would make if the is that what we're talking about, or are we talking about the salary sacrifice here? But if it's the auto enrollment 3%, that's as I mentioned, that is the amount that you can recover up to the limit, whatever the limit is on the furlough grant. So if you've got a cap, for example, of 2,500, then that would be the operating level for the 3%.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Andrew. I've got a couple of questions from Shireen, who's saying, can an employee challenge a furlough if there is ability and willingness to work from home and the workload remains still heavy? And secondly, how does rolling furlough work? Do you have to find an equivalent skilled employee?
Well, dealing with the first one, then on challenge, I think as we've said, a furlough arrangement needs to be agreed with the employee. If they don't agree it, and there's an area of dispute around it, then you've got a difficult situation, and it's then up to the employer to decide whether they agree with the argument or whether actually they need to proceed to a redundancy situation and a reduction in their staff numbers. So yeah, that could be quite an awkward conversation, I think.
Yeah. And the second question?
Could you repeat the second question?
Michael. How does rolling furlough work? Do you have to find an equivalent skilled employee?
Well, I think that's probably a practical question as opposed to a legal one. So the rolling furlough will work. So you choose a period, which has to be a minimum currently, as Hannah said, of 3 weeks. So a period of furlough and then a period of working. If that is a job share, so that you actually need somebody else to fill in and do the work while one employee is on furlough, then presumably they have a mirror image arrangement with the employer to do that. But I imagine if we're talking about a critical support function that needs to be carried out, there would have to be somebody providing that sort of continuity to whoever is the recipient of that service.
Thanks, Michael. Maria, did you want to come in on this particular question? I think I've got Maria. Okay, well, just moving on then. Matthew says, I was on a year-long sabbatical with no pay starting in June 2019. I was retained on the payroll, but with zero income. I've had to return to the UK due to COVID-19. Am I eligible to be furloughed?
So he's remained on the payroll in all that time.
Yeah.
That's a very, very difficult question. It's
yes.
one of those knotty questions that probably one will scratch one's head about. So it's not possible, I think, to give a very immediate answer in relation to that.
I think it's the amount, even if the answer is yes, which it might be, but I wouldn't want to go too big on that. But I think the answer that then you'd be looking at, well, what could actually be the sum payable? What would be the grant on that? And it would be considerably reduced, of course, because of the amounts that you're actually earning and taking the average of last year. So it could be a very small sum.
So can you look at what was earned a year previously? But this is where you've got variable income. You can look at the month in 2019, in March 2019.
Yes, you can.
You might be able to look at the earnings of that month and use that as the...
Well, March 19 would be I'm not sure whether that would actually count, because that would then be in the previous tax year. Possibly. I don't know. I think I'd have to think about that one a bit longer.
Yeah.
I might add here actually that if there are any questions following this webinar, and this might be one of them, if participants can actually email NNEVA, that's NNEEVA @cic.org.uk, and then we can sort of direct them as necessary. So that's NNEEVA, NNEEVA @cic.org.uk. We've got a question from Kevin. Can Andrew give an example of what salary sacrifice is? Because I've never heard of it.
All right. Well, a salary it was very commonplace. It's become a lot more restricted in recent years as the number of benefits in kind have actually been reduced that can now count for a scheme. But the simplest one that I mentioned earlier, which still works, is pension contributions. And there, thinking of an example at random, if you were agreeing a £50,000 package, employment package with your employer, and you decided that you wanted to have of that £40,000 the maximum paid into your own pension scheme, which is the maximum, usually the maximum, and the rest, the 10,000 just as a salary. That would, a salary sacrifice scheme that your employer runs would enable you to do that. And the point behind it being that you're not paying tax first and then using the post-tax income to actually then make your own pension contributions. I mean, the example itself might be a bit skewed and probably a little bit silly, but it's the demonstrative of how it actually works. And also there are tax savings involved, because there would be no employer's national insurance, for example, on the sacrificed amount. So that would be quite efficient for the employer and possibly the employee if the savings were shared in some way, and the employee himself would not be paying employees' national insurance on that salary sacrificed amount. So it can be a great deal for both employer and employee, and it means from a pension point of view, the employee is getting a sufficient amount put into his pension scheme without having to physically pay it over himself.
Okay, thanks for that, Andrew. Just some earlier questions that I haven't, I don't think we've answered yet. One was, can furloughed managers still join in management meetings to keep up to date with company developments? in this particular instance, they're done by Microsoft Teams?
It's probably more of a legal one, but in my view, no. You could, once you're on furlough, you're on furlough. You're not even allowed to look at emails. Yeah,
That's my understanding too.
Yeah.
I agree with that. Yes.
And sort of just scrolling down, I think we've answered the one earlier about furloughed staff can complete non-fee earning work. I think, did we deal with that one, I think? Furloughed staff completing non-fee earning work, yeah. So, Andrew, you mentioned company cars while furloughed or working from home. Can a company car be handed back to the employer for the period in time to reduce the employee's tax liability while the vehicles are being used?
Yes, by agreement, they can. The benefits in kind, a car is obviously a benefit in kind, and sometimes quite often taxed heavily, but depending on the engine capacity. But it doesn't take part in the furlough calculation itself, as I mentioned. But yes, if it's not going to be made available, if he's not going to use it, then yes, he could. Although it's not expected by HMRC that he would have to.
Okay, thank you for that. I've got a question here from Tracy saying we plan to process the job retention scheme claims ourselves as our payroll provider wants to charge extra. Will we be able to access the portal, and if so, when?
Well, the theoretical date, as I mentioned, based on the email I got just before this started, is April the 20th, and that's the date they're going to launch. Although I suspect it will be pandemonium on that date. But in fact, in the email itself, it actually suggests it may be difficult to make the claim on that date. In terms of trying to save money, there is a problem anyway. If you've got a payroll bureau, and obviously anybody that is going to be doing it for you is going to be spending more time doing this, and so it would be normal for them to make some sort of charge. You theoretically should be able to get through and do it yourself. There are certain things certain details you have to have, including the employee's national insurance numbers, etc. In theory, the answer is yes. I think in practice, it's going to be a more difficult point, because there is going to be some dealing with the revenue, which you may not, as the principal person, may not have been doing in the past. So I can see there'll be some very real practical problems arising out of it.
Okay, and I had an early question, apologies to Anthony, which I overlooked, which was, what about additional payments, i.e. standby payments, which forms part of a critical service? E.g., for example, we have surveyors on 24 hours standby for dangerous structures and receive additional monthly payments over the monthly salary.
Yeah, if it's a regular payment, then I believe, my understanding, again, this is where we're dealing with still quite vague notions here, but if it becomes a regular payment and non-variable, it seems possible that becomes part of the wages calculation. If it is variable, you're going back to that calculation again as to how variable pay actually works, and you've got to then take the averages, as I mentioned earlier.
Okay, thank you. And what about if you are at home suffering from COVID-19? Can you still be furloughed?
Well, okay. So the answer to that is that you should be on sick leave, and the guidance suggests that you should stay on sick leave while you're sick, and then be furloughed once you're off sick leave. That does present a few disparities, I think, in how much somebody can earn, and so might seem to be a bit unfair, but that's what the guidance suggests.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. I think we've actually touched on the issue of directors carrying out duties while furloughed. I think we're saying here that actually even the directors cannot carry out their duties while furloughed. Is that the case? particularly the directors versus employees.
They can carry out their statutory duties, or certain statutory duties, but in relation to things that are part of their sort of work contract, if you like, their contract of employment, they can't be doing those. But there are obviously some duties that they have as statutory duties as directors, which they still have, and those continue. So they will need to observe those, and they're allowed to do so. But I think one would need to be pretty disciplined about it if you are a director and you are claiming.
Yeah, because actually you'd be looking at your emails to probably enable you to do it. So whether you just stay to the relevant emails or start looking at all others, where technically, whether it be proved or not, but technically you start moving in breach of the furlough then.
But presumably, I mean, you know, whilst being on furlough, it's acceptable to review emails to enable them to be referred on to other people within the organisation.
I'll bow to Michael on that one, but my understanding was that you normally an employee, once he's on furlough, that's it. It doesn't do anything more than that. It's down to the employer to make alternative arrangements.
I think you can see the revenue arguing that, you know, somebody who had that function to redistribute all their emails was actually not on furlough at all. They were serving the company, and however, you know, modest that was as a part of their day, well, they were still serving the company, and that's not what they should be doing.
It would be quite intriguing to understand how that sort of thing could be policed, frankly, you know, but I guess that's another issue. What about furloughed staff? One from Mark here. Furloughed staff, should they should the furloughed staff be asked to return company computers and mobile phones during the period of furlough? I think that's a point of discretion for. I mean, that they are essentially still employed.
Yeah.
Yeah, so no, they'll need to, you know, as soon as they're back employed and back working, they will need to use them. So I don't think there's any point in returning them other than to perhaps get rid of this sort of suspicion that they might have actually been working because they were retaining them. But I don't think there's a requirement to be returning.
No, and I think actually the revenue's comments on retaining benefits, even though they're not actually part of the calculation, but retaining benefits during the furlough period is probably helpful in that respect as well, to say that yes, you can have the computer in your home office, etc. But of course you can't actually use it for work purposes.
And what about keeping in touch during a period of furlough? Obviously, owners of companies keeping in touch with furloughed staff, particularly if it's due to their if it's part of training. Is that in order?
I think also to look after their to keep a sort of a custodian view of their health and well-being as well. I think I would have thought that was perfectly permissible, actually, provided it is done in a what might be called an altruistic sense, and not as a as here's your work demands, etc. sense.
And I guess so. You know, at the moment where times are so fluid, that whilst there is a minimum period of 3 weeks, you know, should there be an upturn, then I think it's important that, you know, one does keep in touch with furloughed staff.
Yeah.
I've had a question here from James, which is saying, Andrew, did you hear that the scheme will be open on April the 20th from a government source? We were not aware it had been announced yet, but we are a membership organisation and our members would like to know as soon as possible.
Well, assuming this email isn't a fraudulent email that I've just had, but it doesn't look like one, then yes, this came from HMRC. I'm on their update list, and this came in at what time is it? 12:46 today. So it is really hot off the press, and they're saying it's April the 20th. We are ready to launch on 20th of April. I quote.
Okay. Yeah, James, thanks you for that. Yes, and Charles has said they've also had an update from HMRC. I'm not quite sure what this relates to, but there's a question here from Danny saying, pension, also what is paid to the employee?
Well, sorry, and in terms of what, the pension itself?
I presume so, yeah.
Because they won't, the salary, if it's a salary sacrifice, it's outside the system anyway. The employee will receive whatever he's agreed to receive during the furlough period. So there are two different things going on here, actually. One is how much does the employee receive? And the other is what grant can, and it's a taxable grant as well, I probably should have added earlier, but what grant can the employer receive in respect to it? They're not necessarily the same numbers. So it might be, for example, you've got a high paid employee who's on, you've agreed almost across the board with all of them that you're actually going to take the 20%, they're all going to take 20% reduction, they've agreed that, or you can agree a top up, but they may still receive 80% of their actual remuneration, but that doesn't mean to say that you, the employer, are going to receive that as your furlough grant, which will be capped, as we mentioned earlier. Sorry, I think I've forgotten the question there. It was about the pension, wasn't it? You won't actually receive pension. You're being, if we're talking about the auto enrolment 3% contribution, that's going to whoever the pension provider is, and that will continue to go subject to the well, actually, it just continues to go, and then the furlough grant coming back enables you to receive a portion of that or all of it, as the case may be. But they are two separate calculations, actually.
Okay, thanks for that. I can't see any more questions at the moment, and I think we're drawing we're drawing the webinar to a close. I'd just like to stress to everybody that are participating that there is a further webinar on self-employment next week, and we could have another webinar on jobs in a few weeks to update on developments. So I think that there's a further schedule of up and coming webinars on the CIC website if you'd like to refer to that. So I think probably at this point I'd like to thank all our panelists, Hannah Vickers, Steve Corbett, Alan Herbert, Dave Hanna, Andrew Snowden, Michael Archer, of course Maria Coulter, who stood in for me particularly when my computer crashed, and of course I'd also like to thank Graham Watts, our Chief Executive, and all the CIC team. And just a reminder that actually there is a question just come up. How do we get the recording? I don't know whether Graham or Maria can confirm. Is the recording accessible?
It will be, yeah. So literally, I'm going to stop recording as soon as it's finished, and then we can get that issued out basically in the next few days, I would imagine.
I think it will go on our website.
Yeah,
it's the easiest place to put it.
Right. Well,
yeah.
And just sorry, Maria.
Yeah, and we can put a link to the newsletters that go out as well.
Oh, I've got a late question coming in here. Is using LinkedIn permissible under the furlough scheme? That's an interesting one.
I suppose it depends what you're using it for.
I guess so.
Look,
I think
it's social media, so it should be okay.
Yeah, I would think so. I think we should draw that to a close. Once again, thank everybody.
Stephen, could I just make you mentioned the digest, just to let people know that CIC is producing a daily coronavirus digest, and if anybody wants to receive it, they can just send an email to our inquiries or to kpring@cic.org.uk, and they can get the newsletter every day.
Thanks, Graham. And just a reminder that if you do have questions that you think of after the the presentations, to send them to NNEVA, @cic.org.uk. I hope you've all found that very useful and informative. I most certainly did, and I hope you enjoy future webinars. Thank you very much.
Can I just say quickly, thanks to everybody for listening in and taking the time out to do it and ask the questions as well, because it's made for a really interesting discussion. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Marie.